Golson versus Maguire. Who's your man in Tallahassee? Are the Tigers of Clemson finally ready to take down the Noles? And ACC versus the Power Five. Where does the ACC stand in line? Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the ACC Breakdown. This is our premiere right here. I'm extremely excited to be joined by Brittnee Taylor Newman of Football.com. We've got Dan Rubin of BC Interruption. And, of course, from the Rumble seat, we've got Joey Weaver talking Georgia Tech specifically. So we're going to knock this out every Wednesday night. It's going to stream live here on Google Plus and YouTube. And also, you can catch it on various SB Nation platforms as well as my YouTube channel here at MarkRogersTV shortly after we're done with the show. But it's 30 minutes of hardcore football talk and some fun talking about the ACC. And so let's start my panel of distinguished guests with the state of the ACC. This college football playoff has put a different spin on the college football landscape in regards to how we evaluate conferences, and I don't think any scenario played that up more than the Ohio State versus the Big 12, TCU and Baylor last season. So who knows what's going to happen this season, and if the ACC is involved in is this conference better than that conference scenario, and should Florida State, Clemson, Georgia Tech, whoever the ACC champion is, are they comparable to a winner in another conference? So, Brittnee, we're going to start with you. Let's talk about the ACC in regards to how strong you think the conference is, specifically against the other four, and also what you think the perception of the ACC is, considering Florida State just won a national championship 2 years ago. There's a lot of detractors of this conference, though.
Well, it's an interesting question for sure, because I think that this is one of the strongest years that the conference has had in a while. They've really got some contenders on both sides in both divisions. But I think it also might be one of the trickier years for them to be able to get into the playoff. You've got the Pac-12. They've got a lot of depth this year. Even if they don't have a clear front runner yet, there's a lot of really good teams. I think everybody largely expects Ohio State to be back in a playoff spot. And that leaves someone from the SEC. It's hard to imagine they wouldn't submit a player. And that leaves, once again, the Big 12 and the ACC battling it out for the final spot, which is kind of how I see things shaking out. But I think the most telling thing that we saw last year was the way that the committee treated the ACC. Florida State, throughout the ranking process, had at least 20 consecutive wins from the beginning of the ranking process to the end, and still ended up in a number 3 spot. So it appears that perhaps the committee doesn't think very much of the strength of schedule for ACC teams, which we know is a really, really big factor going into placing those 4 teams. So I think it's interesting. I think this is one of the strongest years the conference has had in a while, but may end up being one of the toughest years if you don't have a team completely run the table.
All right, Dan, we'll let you jump in here. The ACC, how does it stack up against the other Power 5 conferences?
Well, I think there's a lot going on there with the ACC in terms of the other conferences, namely because of the committee and the way that the committee tends to view everything in terms of college football. I agree wholeheartedly that Florida State dropping out of the number 1 slot last year was kind of it wasn't something that I think a lot of people respected in terms of the committee's decision. But at the same time, there were a lot of Big 12 people who thought that TCU and Baylor had the inside slot to that 4th spot before Ohio State slid in the last couple of weeks. So I think the committee has shown that it's willing to make a bold move, or at least make a bold ranking based on who passes the smell test and the eye test. And I think that's something that's really going to hurt the ACC because they don't have the Power 5 scheduling requirement yet. When you think of the SEC, whoever wins the SEC, as long as they have 1 loss, they're going to be in the tournament. But then you factor in the fact that the Pac-12 is going to at least factor into this somehow when you have teams like Oregon who are always going to be good and always kind of, like I said, pass that smell test in the eyes of the committee. But then once you get into the other conferences, the Big 10, the ACC, and the Big 12, you're getting into a little bit more of a heated argument on which conference is actually better. But you're not trying to measure the strength of the conference. You're trying to measure the top of the conference. And I think the ACC this year, as long as it's a 1-loss team or an undefeated team, if you're undefeated, you're getting in anyway. But if you're a 1-loss ACC champion, you should be in the top 4 in the country. You will most likely be at least getting the berth. unless Notre Dame decides to go and foul it all up with a one-loss season and factors into that top 4 somehow. But I think this year, the competitive nature at the top of the conference, it actually might hurt the conference, and it'll be really interesting to see what happens. I know the bottom of the league, everyone kind of writes them off, but once you get into the competitive nature, when you have a lot of teams that are very, very good, you're not going to find a team that can actually get in with one loss, because you might wind up with 3 two-loss teams, which essentially means nobody's getting into that top 4.
Hey, Joey, I can't really tell. The shot's a little too tight. Can't tell if your chest is puffed out, because Georgia Tech really there you go. Really made a name for the ACC, because Florida State's a given, Clemson a given to a little bit lesser degree, but Georgia Tech went out and defeated Mississippi State in a bowl game, a team that was ranked number 1 mid-season, that finished in the top 2 or 3 seeds in the SEC, and of course knocked off Georgia in that rivalry game, a Georgia team that finished with 10 wins and finished in the top 10 or 12 in the country. Your thoughts about the ACC?
Yeah, definitely agree with a lot of what's been said so far, and I definitely agree that was a huge end of the season with wins over Georgia and Mississippi State for Georgia Tech. A team that's situated in Atlanta, is very much in the heart of SEC country, and has to recruit against all of the the narrative all the time, and has to deal with that. And so I do agree with what's been said, though. I think that the balance of power has shifted from the last couple of years, where there's no longer one conference that's clearly on top. I think the SEC and Pac-12 are probably the 2 most complete conferences. And then you get the other group of 3. And I think the thing about the ACC is that you have about 4 teams there on top that are pretty solid teams on the national scale. And then you look at the rest of the conference, and you're almost seeing kind of some really good units, but not as much any complete teams. North Carolina's got a really good offense. Virginia Tech's got a really good defense. There's some teams like that are really dangerous on one side of the ball, and if they could just put something together on the other side, they'd really be pretty dangerous. And so I think that's the biggest thing that the ACC has working against it. Not to mention the general parity that seems to go on every single year, where no team can just be generally dominant over everybody. Every team has that 1 or 2 games where they just kind of slip up, and we'll go with, because it's the ACC Breakdown, they pull a Clemson, they do something that they really shouldn't be. And that's a little bit of a college football thing in general, but I think it's definitely true throughout the ACC. And so, kind of like Dan was saying, it's got some teams at the very top, and that's really what matters, is how good is your best team, I think, when it comes to the playoff rankings and all that. But I think that's the biggest attraction on the whole for the conference, is just how you get into the middle of the conference, and there's just not a whole lot of very complete teams. So I think that's the biggest thing holding the league back at this point.
So, Joey, I'm going to split the difference on your argument, because I think that's a little bit of both. Florida State has dominated this league. I went through this. Consider this. 23 years in the ACC, Florida State has won 15 of 23 conference championships, and they had a 7-year drought. So if you're not real bright with math, 15 out of 23, that's 8. They lost for 7 consecutive years. They've won every other ACC championship excluding 1 going back 23 years. So they've won the last 3, and then they dominated prior to 2005. So I think there's a thought that Florida State is the one legitimate program in the ACC. Clemson, we don't know a whole lot about. For those people that really watch college football and are in tune, will take note that Clemson has defeated LSU, Ohio State, and Oklahoma the past 3 bowl seasons. So that should be of note. And I think the mediocrity that you spoke to, Joey, obviously exists in the Coastal Division, where the thought is somebody limps through and wins. Fortunately, Georgia Tech did so not limping through, but being a top 10 team and winning with some authority and really putting the clamps on that championship, and then taking Florida State to the wire, and then winning a BCS, or what used to be a BCS game, in the Orange Bowl, where in the past it's been, oh, this is a bad Duke team, or this is a Georgia Tech team that went 6-6 and is getting to the ACC championship game. I think Miami coming back and being somewhat close to what they've been in the past, and Virginia Tech would really help this league. SEC fans, take note, the ACC went 5-2 against the SEC. Not all of those games were comparable seeds, so that has to be taken into consideration, but many of them were, and the ACC played very well last year, going 5-2. So really quickly, I'm going to go Brittnee, Dan, and Joey. maybe you're not ready for this, but out of the Power 5, where would you rank the ACC, Brittnee?
4.
Okay, Dan.
I'm going to get Twitter hate for that so much. I know it's coming.
Well, I'm putting them third. I'm going third. I think they're still better than top to bottom. I know they're better than the Pac-12, and I still think they're better than the Big 12 as well.
Okay, Joey.
I'd probably tie them at third with the Big 10.
Okay, a tie.
Yeah,
we're not going to allow ties in the future, Joey. I probably should have laid down those ground rules from the start. I've got them at number 4. I think this is a much better football conference than it was just a few years ago, but I think the Big 10 is still a little bit better than the ACC, and I think the Big 12 has taken a huge step back. Oklahoma and specifically Texas, nothing close to what they've been in the past, and TCU and Baylor make it very top-heavy, and there are some really bad programs, i.e. Iowa State and Kansas in the Big 12, so I think they're last. I got the ACC at a pretty solid number 4. So what's going to play into the perception, obviously, are going to be these non-conference games, and I love really good non-conference games. I don't think we play enough of them. SEC especially don't play enough of them, so I'm not going to pick on the ACC here. Actually, I think the ACC goes out and plays more quality non-conference games than just about any other league, and one of the reasons is because they've got those cross rivalries with the SEC that play out at the end of the year, i.e. Georgia Tech, Louisville, Kentucky, Florida State. So regardless of how you consider Notre Dame, are they an ACC team or not? That has obviously really bulked up the scheduling for the ACC and the strength of schedule. So, Joey, what do you have for us in regards to those non-conference games that you're really looking forward to seeing the SEC play or the ACC play and think could really play into perception and a college football playoff berth?
Sure. So aside from the games that you mentioned, not only Notre Dame playing all the games against ACC teams, as well as kind of that set of 4 games at the end against the SEC with Georgia Tech and Georgia, South Carolina, Clemson, Louisville, Kentucky, Florida State, Florida. There were 4 games other than that on the schedule that really stuck out to me as pretty crucial games this season. And I think the cool thing is that 3 of them happened the very first weekend of the year. And so that really kind of gives the opportunity to set the narrative moving forward throughout the entire season. The first one on my list is Thursday night, the opening night of the season. It's North Carolina at South Carolina. 2 years ago, Jadeveon Clowney's senior campaign, or I guess junior campaign, got off to a start in Chapel Hill. And so now North Carolina makes the return trip down to take on South Carolina at home. Again, very strong offense at North Carolina. It'll be interesting to see if they can just kind of pick up where they left off from last year. And if they can get anything out of that defense, I think that actually sets up fairly well for North Carolina outside of the fact that it's on the road. Second one is that Saturday, the first big Saturday of the season, and it's Louisville taking on Auburn in the Georgia Dome. In the Chick-fil-A Kickoff Classic, again, a huge game, very big on the national stage. A lot of eyeballs going to be watching that game. Can Bobby Petrino continue to improve that offense while they keep up the defense under Todd Grantham? Sorry. The third one is that Monday of that first weekend, and it's, of course, the famous national rematch of Ohio State. They travel to Virginia Tech. Of course, that was the one blemish on Ohio State's record last year. They're going to be out for revenge, but they got to go get it in Blacksburg, which is never an easy place to play. There's going to be a very strong defense for Virginia Tech. Can they get anything out of their offense? That's, again, the thing you got to wait and see. And the last one on my radar is actually a few weeks later. It's when Nebraska travels to Miami to return that favor. Last year, Nebraska won it at home. I think it had about a 10-point win. Can Miami get their season started off pretty well? It's Al Golden is kind of on a warm seat right now, so we'll see what his team has for us in 2015. Those are the 4 main games outside of the usual suspects that I'm watching for this year.
Right, Dan. No mention of Wofford here. That's not allowed. No Citadel games. What do you have for us in regards to the games that you're really eyeing in terms of non-conference?
Well, I was really looking forward to that Rhode Island at Syracuse game. I mean, that one jumped off the schedule to me, and I don't know how you can resist wanting to watch that one. I mean, that's going to be a barn burner for an FCS playoff. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. Syracuse isn't an FCS team, though they played like it last year.
Give them a few years.
I'm going to take some Twitter heat for that, and I can't wait. No, I agree with a couple things that Joey pointed out. I think that Virginia Tech-Ohio State game is going to be fantastic to watch, especially because all we've heard about in the preseason is Ohio State's offense. They got all the quarterbacks. Cardale Jones is fantastic. Braxton Miller. They've been running 2 quarterback formations where they can run the option and use all these different guys. And they're going to play a team that might be one of the best defenses in the country, preseason ranking-wise. I know Virginia Tech jumps off the table as being a completely filthy defense. So if Virginia Tech comes out and beats Ohio State again, well, now we're talking and rocking and rolling as part of the ACC, regardless of what happens with Virginia Tech the rest of the season, because they still have to go to East Carolina, which is apparently an Achilles heel for them, as their performance has shown. Some of the other games that I'm really watching, I love the Notre Dame scheduling arrangement because it opens up some interesting possibilities for the non-conference schedule. I can't wait to see Notre Dame play Clemson this year. I saw it last year when Notre Dame played Florida State. It turned into, for lack of a better term, an instant classic. One of the non-conference games involving Notre Dame that jumps off the schedule is actually going to be up here. Boston College always plays Notre Dame tough. It's a huge rivalry that's been kind of filtered out of the lurch because of Notre Dame's scheduling with the ACC scheduling. This gets them back into the game, gets them back into a game against each other, and they're going to move it into the Shamrock Series this year. So it's a Notre Dame home game at Fenway Park. Once you put all of those factors into it, it's going to be an electric atmosphere, and knowing that the rivalry is there, I mean, that's something that I'm really pumped for in terms of Notre Dame in general being a part of this of kind of the scheduling arrangement. Miami, Nebraska, that's almost a must-win for the ACC in terms of boosting its image. Miami struggled last year. They're playing a Nebraska team that I don't think is particularly powerful towards the top of the Big Ten. Miami wants to be a 9-win team. They have to win a game like that against a team like Nebraska. Games like that. Louisville with their tough schedule all around. Auburn, they play Houston, they play Kentucky. Houston, I know they're an AAC team. Louisville probably will beat them, but it's still a team that at least you look at and you kind of take note of on the schedule in terms of a non-Power 5. I know I do at least. Just at least the name recognition is enough to kind of sway some of the voters. And worst comes to worst, you want a tough non-conference schedule. If Virginia does anything with their schedule, they're going to be all of a sudden the top 15 team. UCLA, Notre Dame, and Boise State, and I mean William & Mary's their one FCS team, but that's not even counting their conference schedule. They win 8-9 games, they should be a top 15 team hands down. So I think there's possibilities in the non-conference schedule which are sometimes overlooked. But if you're a college football purist and you look for them in there, there's some really exciting games, and I think that it's something that can only get better as we see the season progress.
Yeah, if you're not aware, that brilliant college football channel, MarkRogersTV, actually declared Virginia to have the toughest non-conference schedule in the country. So, all right, Brittnee, if they left you any games, I don't know if they did. The one thing I'll know before I pitch it to you is that Florida State, they schedule out of conference extremely tough. So last year, for example, Oklahoma State, Notre Dame, which kind of got a sign for them, but still Oklahoma State, Notre Dame, and the annual tussle with Florida at the end of the season. So they've backed off a little bit this year. They just have the Florida game. So what games are standing out for you?
Well, it's definitely not the other non-conference game that Florida State is opening up with, which is against Texas State in Tallahassee the very first weekend. But I completely agree with the guys on all of those. I love the Notre Dame matchups. I think these are really exciting. I'm definitely excited to see Georgia Tech play Notre Dame. I'm on the Georgia Tech Rambling Wreck bandwagon this year for sure. That's actually their 35th meeting. It's kind of a classic. I have an uncle that played at Georgia Tech. He was there the year after the famous Notre Dame-Georgia Tech matchup where they chanted for Rudy. He wasn't there for that one. He was there the year after. But for me, it's got some old school charm to it. So I'm basically on board with everything that they said and really, really impressed by the AD at Virginia and their non-conference schedule this year. I'm curious to know, Cavs fans, are you excited about this? Are you a little nervous? Because that is one heck of a non-conference schedule.
When we find any Cavs fans, we'll ask them. I actually know one. I do know one Virginia Cavalier fan who's extremely passionate about his basketball program. No, his football team as well. But yeah, that's just brutal. So I don't know if the athletic director should be commended or he's never going to get any Christmas cards probably from Mike London after this season. We'll see how that plays out. But that's brutal. UCLA, Boise State, and, of course, the game against Notre Dame. That's like a non-conference that Alabama or Ohio State should be playing or something like that. But I heard no mention of Wake, Indiana, but there's the sleeper for you. That's a real sleeper for you. My true sleeper here, though, folks, is going to be Northwestern taking on Duke. So we know what Duke's done the last few years. They're 19-8 the past couple seasons, 3 consecutive bowl trips. They may take a bit of a slide this year, but if they're able to maintain, they could be in for a decent bowl game, and they've got a decent matchup with a Northwestern team that should be better than 5-7 as they were in the Big Ten last year. All right, folks, we got a quarterback situation there in Tallahassee with Florida State losing Jameis Winston off to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Everett Golson comes in from Notre Dame. It was my initial thought that starter, name it right now, he's the guy, despite the injury, or not the injury issues, but the off-field issues, and despite the turnover issues with 14 interceptions and 8,300 fumbles, whatever he had last season, I thought Everett Golson was going to be the guy, but he's receiving quite a tussle from Sean Maguire. So, Dan, let's start with you talking about this Florida State quarterback situation.
Well, I've made no secret that I'm not really on the Everett Golson bandwagon, and there's a number of reasons for it. I don't particularly care for a guy who, and I know that comes out wrong when I say that, a guy who kind of transfers in his 5th year into the perfect situation. He realizes he lost the starting job at Notre Dame, probably heading into this year, or would be challenged for it. So he decides to transfer out, pick your spot. He winds up at Florida State. And it's almost like a race for free agency at that point for a graduate transfer. He could have gone, and I think he had the list of schools, and they had the list of schools where they would have released him, that sort of thing. All the different things that went into it, I just, something stinks about the way that it went down, for me at least, that he winds up playing for Florida State. They get another Heisman guy who was in the Heisman discussion. I just don't love it. That said, I'm also a big Sean Maguire fan. I thought he handled the situation last year in the game that he played against Clemson very well. I thought he did throw a couple of picks in the Clemson game, but he also threw for 300 yards and a touchdown while placed in almost an impossible situation. You had all the hoopla around the suspension for Jameis Winston, the fact that he came out in pads to warm up, gets sent to the locker room, winds up on the sideline. The camera was constantly on him. Sean Maguire came out and played well in that game, and I think when you look at the type of quarterback Sean Maguire is, he's a guy that you just kind of like watching. He's not from the South. He's not from the deep South in terms of football factor. He's out of Texas or Alabama or anything like that. He's a guy out of New Jersey, which New Jersey does have its solid type quarterbacks, or solid type prospects. But he's a pocket style passer. He's a guy that you can really install as a quarterback who can throw the good routes. He can step up in the pocket, sling it a little bit. His reputation coming into college was that he was going to be a quarterback that was kind of a throwback pro-style quarterback like a Cody Kessler. He comes into college. We only have a small sample size of which to work on, but it's enough for me to say, look, this is a guy who knows the system. This is a guy who's been in the system for a couple of years. Let's see what he got. Let's give him a shot. And maybe we tinker with the system around him at Florida State, and next thing you know, it's an entirely different blue-collar style football that they're playing, as opposed to last year and the year before when they were outscoring teams and really killing them.
So that analysis, courtesy Dan Rubin and BC Interruption. And before I pitch it to Joey, I'm going to give BC that obligatory pat on the back that I usually like to give them when I talk to Dan, because what they did against Florida State the last 2 years, considering the Noles went undefeated both seasons in the ACC, and Boston College scared the heck out of them both seasons, going up 17-zip at home, and then the last season going down to the last drive, and I thought they might pull it off before the offense bogged down close to the red zone. So BC has given Florida State fits. We will see if anybody can give them fits to the wire and actually pull off a victory this season. I think it's going to happen. Joey, Maguire versus Golson, what do you see right now?
Yeah, so I'm kind of with both of you guys where, Mark, when you said you originally saw that this was happening and, oh, Golson is just automatically the starter. I mean, that was kind of my immediate reaction. Definitely with Dan in saying that it didn't quite feel right, or, it kind of felt a little strange. I'm not a huge fan of it. The thing that as I look at it more, the thing that sticks out to me, and I'll try to keep this short so that Brittnee gets her, this is more her territory, I think, with Florida State, but the thing to me is that Golson, everyone's going to remember him that he was the quarterback for that national championship, national runner-up Notre Dame team a few years back. And I think everyone's mind wants to immediately go to, oh, he was the quarterback of this team that made it all the way to the national championship game. He must be really good. And the thing that people forget about that Notre Dame team is that offense was nothing special. Against BCS competition, they were not even a top 50 team in scoring offense. They scored less than 25 points a game. It wasn't like they were just running up the score on people and playing some video game offense. And so I think that, especially that combined with his turnover issues in recent years, I'm not so sold on Golson as a quarterback, and I'm really interested to see which one they decide to go with. And as was said earlier, Maguire did pretty well in his duties last year when he got the chance. So I think that may actually end up shocking the world, when they pick Maguire and he sticks with it as the starter for most of the season.
I am chomping at the bit to give you my Golson take, but I am the courtesy, humble host, so Brittnee, take it away.
Well, I agree with what both the guys said. It was interesting when I heard that he was transferring in. I think what is also interesting, last week, after end of the week scrimmage, Coach Fisher was talking to some reporters and basically said that he wasn't against trying a 2 QB system, that he was going to wait and let the performance of both quarterbacks determine what he was going to do. And I kind of don't want to call his bluff on that, but I think that would be a really, really bad idea at Florida State. You're moving from an era where you had some really unquestionable leadership in Jameis Winston. He was definitely the leader on the field, in the locker room, very much an alpha dog. And so to take the guys on the roster now and put them in a position where they've got 2 quarterbacks just doesn't really seem to make sense. And I think situations where you've seen this work before, like in Oklahoma with Landry Jones and Blake Bell, or at Florida with Chris Leak and Tim Tebow, you had one guy who was primarily a passer and then another guy who was more of a dual threat quarterback, who could run, who had legs, could toss the ball if he needed to. And so you knew when the dual threat quarterback was going to be placed in those short yardage situations. So the team didn't really have to question so many things. We know we've got Chris Leak or Landry Jones until this moment arrives, and then we've got QB number 2. We don't have that situation right now. That's not what we're looking at. The Seminoles have 2 guys that are both primarily passers, so if you're going to start splitting reps between them, you're asking receivers in the center and even the running backs to memorize body language and rhythm and, eye flicks and everything for 2 different guys, which can get really, really confusing. So I think if he doesn't pick a quarterback soon, it may backfire on him. They may be looking at an identity crisis. But I kind of wonder if he's sort of just using that to play the 2 against each other with the sole intent of picking someone. He may even have determined in his mind already who he's going to select before he moves forward. But I think it's probably in his best interest and the interest of the team to select someone as soon as possible so that they can go ahead and start forming an identity around that quarterback.
I would tend to agree with that analysis right there. The team naturally looks to the quarterback to be the leader regardless of whether there is true leadership capability there. The position just sets up for it. I understand, rumor has it that Urban Meyer has a similar situation at Ohio State from what I understand. I don't know too much about it, but that's how it's playing out at this point, apparently. My take on Golson, and much of this is maybe repetition about what Joey talked about. I was very impressed with him as a freshman, considering he was a freshman. No, they didn't tear teams up. They didn't tear defenses up. They very much made it to the national championship game in similar fashion in regards to pulling out games, i.e. Florida State getting to the national playoff last year. They had a goal line stand against Stanford. They had a missed field goal against the likes of Pitt and BYU, who were very marginal teams, to miss kicks that would have sent Notre Dame to defeat. Michigan completely outgained them and dominated the game, but Notre Dame was able to pick off Denard Robinson who was never a quarterback, but that's another subject. 4 times, otherwise Michigan wins, and on and on. They had a number of those high wire acts. They make it to the national championship. So that's not to discredit Golson, because, again, as a freshman, I saw where Notre Dame eventually opened up the offense, and he became more of a playmaker down the stretch and won some games for them. He had the transgressions. He misses the season. He comes back. And it's strange to see a guy who made bigger plays possibly as a junior, but on the flip side cost his team, where he was much more a caretaker of the offense and game manager and effective protecting the football as a freshman. Usually you see the strides made down the line, but he got very careless with the football last year. The one impressive note I'll make about Everett Golson's season in 2014 would be, number one, that aside from a questionable call at the goal line, he could have beaten Florida State when his team was undefeated. Who knows what the ramifications or impact was on Notre Dame going down the stretch. They lost 5 games. In the bowl game against LSU, Music City Bowl, he gets benched. Malik Zaire, the running quarterback, is given the call, and Golson got yanked in that game several times, and he delivered time and time again. He proved himself to be a much more competent passer than Malik Zaire by a long stretch. So Notre Dame fans may miss a pocket passer this season when Zaire's running all over the place. And the impressive thing to me was knowing that he got benched for the first time in his career leading into that game, comes off the bench, converts like 3 third and fourth down plays with like rocket passes in the seam to convert third and fourth downs, and Notre Dame completes the win over LSU as an upset win. So I was impressed with that performance out of Everett Golson, but it should be interesting to see who wins this thing out, Maguire or Golson. And for a situation under Jimbo Fisher in which he's been able to rely on a superior quarterback play, a guy that's driven him nuts off the field when there's 2 minutes left on the clock and he's needed a score in the fourth quarter, he's been able to rely on famous Jameis, and it's all worked out well. So he doesn't have that guy at least in place from what we can see right now. We'll see if either Golson or especially Maguire would grow into that kind of leader. All right, any parting shots from the field here? Silence. But that was a great show. So again, this is the ACC Breakdown. We're going to be here every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern talking ACC football, breaking it down and having a whole lot of fun. This week joined by Brittnee Taylor Newman of Football.com. We got Dan Rubin of BC Interruption, and also Joey Weaver from the Rumble Seat on the SB Nation platform for Georgia Tech. All right, ladies, gentlemen, thank you much for the support tonight. This was a good time. I'm going to have a lot of fun with this, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you bet.
Enjoyed it. Thanks.